Welcome back. We have been talking about firewalls, the distributed firewall without logical switching, all these different things about how we're going to deal with segmentation and firewalls in NSX. And way back at the beginning of this series of videos, we mentioned that we had a gateway firewall, and that's what we're finally talking about here. So we'll talk about, what the gateway firewall is there for, why we have it, how you manage it. You might not be surprised to see that we manage this in a lot of ways, just like the distributed firewall, except our policies are going to target different things. So the gateway firewall exists on our tier 0 and our tier 1 gateways, but it is only realized on what we call the northbound facing interface, right? The uplink interface on a tier 0 gateway, the router link interface, uplinking us to a tier 0 gateway from a tier 1 gateway, but that's the only place it lives, right? So we have to think about that when we're planning our gateway firewall, right? This is separate from the distributed firewall. It's strictly on the gateways, and it's here to provide kind of a tenant perimeter, if you will. If we think about the tier 1 gateway maybe as a tenant boundary, or even a tier 0 gateway, we can set a perimeter at that tier 0 gateway, protecting traffic in and out of that gateway perimeter. Which means that, for example, here we've got our yellow tier 1 gateway on the right. Well, if one of my workloads in the 10.1.1 yellow segment want to talk to a workload in the 10.2.2 green segment, well, that traffic's going to traverse a downlink interface to get to the tier 1 gateway, and then directly out another connected downlink interface to connect to the 10.2.2 network. In other words, the traffic there never crosses that northbound facing interface. It'll never be filtered by the distributed firewall. Traffic between the gateways from, say, the blue 20.2.2 network to 10.2.2, that traffic will be filtered because that traffic will go through the gateway firewall on the yellow tier 1 gateway. So we've got to think about packet flow here as far as what will and will not be matched by my gateway firewall rules. The gateway firewall also has a number of categories very similar to what we're looking at with the distributed firewall, right? The emergency category is what we're going to use that for the exact same reason. We're going to put quarantine and other emergency rules in there, things that need to be processed first. The system category, here, as well as the auto service category, these are grayed out, right? These boxes here are grayed out. Well, they're grayed out because you and I, we're not going to configure rules in there. The system category is where the system is going to create rules for the system to function, BFD or VPN control plane, things like that. The auto service category, well, this is where rules that are required for my services to function will automatically be configured, right? So when I configure a service on a gateway and it needs a firewall rule, this is where that firewall rule is going to go. Now, we may put rules in the pre-rules category. We're going to put rules in the pre-rules category when they are configured to apply to multiple gateways. In other words, if a rule applies to more than one gateway, we probably want to process that rule first, and so it's going to be placed in this pre-rules category. Local gateway, this is where all of my gateway-specific policies and rules will be created, right? So if I have tenant 1 that has tenant 1 policies, they'll go in their local gateway, and then tenant 2 and tenant 2's tier 1 gateway, they'll have their tenant 2 specific policies and things like that, right? And then finally, we have our default rule, which again in NSX is just an allow all. Creating policy, well, I can create that either in my all shared rules or my gateway shared rules tab, or in my gateway specific rules tab. If I'm in gateway specific rules, I want to make sure that I'm selecting the right gateway. It's so easy in a drop-down menu to accidentally grab the wrong object and then start creating rules and wonder why they're not being hit. Well, because we've applied them, we've built them on the wrong gateway. So make sure you've selected the correct gateway in the drop-down menu, and then we can start building gateway firewall policy, more or less mechanically the same way we did with our distributed firewall. So I create my policies, and my policies have the same settings, right? Do I want this stateful or stateless? Now my gateway HA mode is going to impact whether or not I can set a stateful policy. But it's still set on the policy. Do I want to lock the policy? Do I want to enable TCP strict enforcement on the policy, right? On the rules in the policy, what do we want to do? How do I want my policy and the rules in my policy configured? I also have time-based policies on the gateway firewall. And then I can add rules to the gateway firewall, just the same way we did with the distributed firewall. I hit the vertical ellipses and add rule, and I add however many rules I need, and I start populating them with all of the same fields. I have my rule settings that I can look at where I can enable or disable logging for the rule, or the directionality of the rule, or set a log label, right? This all looks pretty familiar at this point, doesn't it? We are going to use the same objects, right? The groups and services and everything. The gateway firewall architecture is similar, very similar to the distributed firewall, except that the entire data plane is housed in the data path of the edge transport node. The data path of the edge transport node is kind of a consolidated, interesting function of DPDK, right? The way we have to implement it. So we really don't break things down beyond, we have a data path. Now, here we do show the rule classifier on that uplink interface. And the rule classifier maintains the rule table, and then we've got a tool that maintains a state table or a flow table for our stateful gateway firewall policies. And the processing, the rule processing function is essentially the same as what we talked about with the distributed firewall, where we have a connection or a flow table that we'll look at first to see if we all have an already allowed flow. If we do, great. Then we'll go ahead and act on that. We'll forward that packet along. But the connection table, the flow table, is just for the allowed flows, the already allowed flows. If we have a connection table miss, then we'll look at the rule table, which is programmed into a function called the rule classifier. The rule classifier maintains our table of firewall rules, and it processes, well, just like any other firewall rule table. We'll start at the top, work our way down until we get our first match, and then we'll act on that match. Now, if we allow that packet, we'll go ahead and forward that packet and update the flow table. If we drop or reject, well, we're simply going to silently drop or actively reject the packet. So let's play with this for a couple of minutes, right? Mechanically, this is almost identical to the distributed firewall. Our rules are going to be a little different. They're going to be have a little bit different spirit to them. We're not protecting virtual machines from each other. We're protecting virtual machines from something outside our perimeter. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at SSH connectivity from our desktop. We're going to make sure that works before we build our policies. We're going to create our policy and rules to block SSH from outside. We're going to see how that works. We're also going to see that doesn't impact things inside the gateway. And then when we prepare for the next lab, it's going to be a matter of disabling those policies. So come back when you're done with this lab, when you're done with lab 12, come back and we'll go ahead and wrap up not only this video, but this entire firewall section. See you in a few minutes. All right, we're back. We saw that the gateway firewall is mechanically almost identical to the distributed firewall. We're pretty good at being consistent that way. And we saw that it was pretty easy to block traffic from the outside if we need to. So we've covered a lot of ground in this series of videos. We've talked about the distributed firewall and the gateway firewall. We talked about the the distributed firewall on a VDS only deployment. In other words, no NSX segments involved. We've talked about stateful and stateless firewalls. We've talked about rules and groups and services. Oh my. We've talked about how to build our gateway or perimeter firewall. And then we started out by talking about segmentation and zero trust security and how that all comes together. A whole lot of stuff here. But we're not done with security. If you come back for the next series of videos, we're going to start talking about advanced threat prevention stuff. So more security is on deck. I can't wait to see you in the new series.